America faces another turning point. Tariffs, policy tools reviewed by Trump's new trade agenda, are shaking up global commerce. They promise a re-establishment of America as a global and economic superforce and the return of domestic production, shedding the US's reliance on other countries and increasing their export prowess. The world is on edge, with Canada, Mexico, and Europe being left in shambles because of the new tariffs, and China promising a retribution that will decimate the US's economy. Will these protective measures deliver on the promise to restore American manufacturing dominance, or is this just an opening salvo in a damaging global trade war that nobody wins? President Trump wasted no time implementing his economic agenda after his January 2025 inauguration. Within his first 30 days in office, he announced a sweeping 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, citing border security concerns and trade imbalances. The move fulfilled one of his key campaign promises to leverage economic pressure for policy concessions. Mexico's economy, heavily dependent on exports to the United States, which is $372 billion in 2024, immediately felt the impact. The Mexican peso depreciated 8% against the dollar in the week following the announcement, and President Claudia Sheinbaum called the tariffs economic aggression, but quickly entered negotiations to address U.S. concerns. Meanwhile, Canada faced a 10% tariff on automotive exports and select agricultural products. Prime Minister Trudeau condemned the action as a violation of the USMCA agreement, which had replaced NAFTA during Trump's first term. As a result, the Bank of Canada warned that these tariffs could reduce Canada's GDP growth by 0.4% in 2025. The administration defended these tariffs as temporary leverage to secure better terms, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that these aren't permanent barriers, but tools to ensure fair trade and national security. However, this economic disruption was immediate. U.S. automakers with integrated supply chains across North America saw component costs rise significantly, with Ford reporting a 12% increase in production expenses for vehicles assembled in U.S. plants. Now, by March 2025, Trump expanded his tariff campaign globally. China faced the harshest measures with a comprehensive 60% tariff on manufactured goods, up from the previous administration's approximately 20% average rate. This marked the most aggressive trade action against China in modern history, explicitly targeting strategic sectors like electronics, rare earth minerals, and pharmaceuticals. The White House justified these actions under Section 301 of the Trade Act, citing intellectual property theft and economic security concerns. China has benefited from unfair practices for decades, stated U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who returned to his position from Trump's first term. These tariffs level the playing field. Now, for allies outside of North America, the administration imposed targeted tariffs: 25% on European automobiles, 15% of Japanese electronics, and varying rates on steel and aluminum imports globally. Trump framed these actions through his America First lens and stated that every country protects its industries. America is finally doing the same. The World Trade Organization immediately came under pressure as multiple nations filed complaints. However, the U.S. administration signaled its disregard for WTO rulings, with National Economic Council Director Howard Lutnick stating that the WTO has failed American workers for decades. We are acting in our national interest. Unlike previous tariff rounds, this new measure came with specific conditions for removal. Countries could negotiate exemptions by agreeing to purchase minimum quantities of American agricultural products, energy resources, or manufacturing goods. This transactional approach represented a fundamental shift away from rules-based trade towards bilateral deal-making. Now, out of all of America's allies, Europe was struck the most, with 25% tariffs on its 56 billion euro automotive exports to the US. As a result, the European Union responded with strategic countermeasures. Rather than matching US tariffs dollar for dollar as in 2018, the EU adopted a surgical approach. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced 35% tariffs on US agricultural exports from Republican-dominated states and 30% on digital services from America tech giants. "We will not engage in destructive trade war, but we will protect European interests," von der Leyen declared. "Our response is proportionate, targeted, and WTO compliant." The EU simultaneously accelerated trade negotiations with China and India, aiming to reduce the dependence on American markets. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron jointly proposed a European economic security strategy to identify critical supply chains and reduce external vulnerabilities. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, seeking preferential status after Brexit, initially attempted to negotiate tariff exemptions in exchange for increased purchases of American liquefied natural gas. However, these talks stalled when the US demanded agricultural concessions incompatible with British food strategy standards. Prime Minister Keir Starmer ultimately aligned with the EU position, stating that we cannot sacrifice our standards or our European partnerships. Perhaps most significantly, the EU accelerated plans for a digital euro and alternative payment mechanisms to reduce dollar dependency. Christine Lagarde, European Central Bank President, pointedly remarked, "Economic sovereignty requires payment autonomy, and recent events only strengthen our resolve." This coordinated European response demonstrated a more unified trade strategy than during the previous tensions, reflecting lessons learned from Trump's first term and increased awareness of economic independence. While President Trump championed tariffs as job creators and trade deficit reducers, economic data suggests more complex outcomes. Analysis from the Congressional Budget Office project that the 2025 tariff regime would reduce US GDP by 0.3 to 0.7% over 2 years, while increasing consumer prices by 1.2% annually. For American consumers, though, the impact was immediate. The Consumer Price Index showed a 0.8 monthly increase in March 2025, the largest jump since 2022. Essential consumer goods faced pressure. Appliance prices rose 14%, electronics 9%, and automobile prices increased by an average of $1,850 per vehicle, according to J.D. Power data. Manufacturing companies with global supply chains reported significant disruptions too. Apple announced delays in iPhone production as it scrambled to relocate assembly operations from China. Tesla increased prices on all models by 7 to 12% due to battery component tariffs. Even American steel producers like Nucor, initially supportive of protection, warned that tariffs on specialized alloy inputs were compromising their competitiveness in finished products. Small businesses have been disproportionately affected too, lacking the resources to quickly reconfigure supply chains. A National Federation of Independent Business survey found that 64% of small manufacturers reported difficulty absorbing or passing on tariff costs, with 28% considering workforce reductions. Global economic institutions raised alarms about systemic risks. The International Monetary Fund revised its global growth forecast downward by 0.5 percentage points for 2025, citing trade tensions as the primary factor. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva warned escalating trade barriers fragment the global economy at the time when cooperation is essential to address shared challenges. Perhaps most concerning are early signs of financial market strain. Currently, volatility has increased dramatically, complicating international investment. Emerging markets like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico, all deeply integrated into global supply chains, have experienced capital overflows and currency depreciation exceeding 15% in some cases. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimates that if current tariffs remain and announced retaliatory measures are implemented, global trade could contract by 4.5% over 2 years, the largest decline since 2008's financial crisis. Now, 3 months into President Trump's second term, evaluating the success of his tariff strategy remains challenging at best, but preliminary data offers some insights. On the positive side, certain manufacturing sectors have responded very favorably. U.S. Steel announced plans to reopen 2 blast furnaces in Pennsylvania, potentially creating 500 jobs. The American Textile Manufacturers Institute reported that member companies intend to increase domestic production by 12%, citing improved price competitiveness against imports. The administration has also secured some diplomatic victories and accepted a managed trade arrangement for agricultural products to avoid escalating tariffs. South Korea negotiated tariff exemption by committing to substantial investments in American semiconductor manufacturing. However, broader economic indicators show mixed results. The trade deficit with China decreased by 8% in the first quarter of 2025, but the overall U.S. trade deficit remained virtually unchanged as imports shifted to Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries not targeted by the highest tariffs. Job creation in manufacturing has been modest, with the Bureau of Labor Statistics reporting only 28,000 new positions in tariff-protected sectors during February and March. However, this was partially offset by 19,000 job losses in industries dependent on imported components or facing retaliatory tariffs. Financial markets have expressed skepticism about the tariff strategy's long-term benefits. The S&P 500 declined 7% from January to April 2025, with particularly sharp losses in retail, technology, and automotive sectors. Bond markets signaled concern as well, with the yield curve temporarily inverting in March. Historically, this is a recession warning. Consumer sentiment, as measured by the University of Michigan Index, fell to its lowest level since 2020, with 72% of respondents citing concerns about rising prices. This suggests that even if tariffs eventually strengthen certain domestic industries, the immediate consumer impact could undermine public support. Most economies remain concerned about longer-term effect, though. A survey of 43 former Council of Economic Advisors members from both Republican and Democratic administrations found that 89% believed the current tariff strategy would reduce American economic growth over a 5-year horizon. The Peterson Institute calculated that American consumers are effectively paying approximately $45 billion annually in higher prices, roughly $350 per household, while the government collects about $40 billion in tariff revenue. President Trump's aggressive tariff strategy represents a fundamental realignment of American trade policy not seen since 1930s. While the administration has secured some tactical victories and energized portions of manufacturing sector, the broader economic costs are mounting. The coming months will determine whether these tariffs represent a temporary negotiation tactic or a permanent shift towards economic nationalism. Global supply chains built over decades cannot be reconfigured overnight, and the friction of adjustment is creating real economic pain across multiple sectors. What's clear is that the world economy has entered a new era of managed trade, where geopolitical considerations increasingly override pure economic efficiency. Whether this approach ultimately makes America great again remains an open question, one that will be answered not by rhetoric, but by economic results that affect millions of American workers, businesses, and consumers.